Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started. This is our PARCC Accessibility Features and Test Accommodations webinar. Presenting today is me, Phyllis Lynch. I'm the Director of the Office of Instruction, Assessment, and Curriculum at RIDE. And I'm Heather Heineke, and I typically work on all of the alternate assessment, alternate assessment assessments, but I'm also working on the PARCC Accessibility Features and Test Accommodations. So we're going to go through a PowerPoint presentation, and we're going to ask that you hold your questions until the end. It is a lot harder with a webinar to allow questions as we go along, so we're going to wait to the end. For those of you who have been part of the trainings that we've had so far, we're hoping to clarify some things where we know we've heard questions and provide some updates as well. So please hold questions until the end. So here's our agenda today. We're going to start with just a general overview of what the PARCC system looks like, which should be very familiar to most of you. Go briefly through the decision-making process, and then go through the accessibilities and accommodations for all students, for students with disabilities, and English language learners. So, as you all know, PARCC system for accommodations is quite different than the way we did it with NECAP. As a reminder, for NECAP, all students could have any accommodation. For PARCC, we have a more of a tiered system to address student supports and needs through the assessment. So there are features for all students. So these are things that any student can have access to. For paper, there would be some things that might need to be done ahead of time to be prepared for it. But for the most part, these are things that the students on the computer, they log in and are there. And for, or it's just something a student asks for as they go along. So we'll explain those as we go through. Then there are accessibility features that need to be identified in advance. And there are 3 of these. And these are open to all students. However, they need to be identified in advance. And we'll talk about what those are and why. And then finally, there are accommodations. And anything we talk about that is listed as accommodations are only for students who it is within their IEP, 504 plan, or are an English language learner. So before we dive into those accommodations, we want to spend a few minutes talking about the decision-making process. Now, this isn't a required process, but we have found it certainly helpful as folks think about accommodations and how to make decisions. So the first one is an obvious one that I hope we're already there, right, is expect students to achieve grade level content standards. Right? All students must have access to grade level academic curriculum and must receive supports to address the needs for helping students access the content. When students don't have access to the grade level content that they are going to be assessed on, it makes them really hard to demonstrate that content. So we really want to make sure that we're providing students with the content they need, which are their grade level content standards. Next step is to have a full understanding of the accessibility features and accommodations available on the PARCC assessment. So certainly this is one resource that will help you do that. However, this does not substitute the need to really spend some time looking at the accessibility feature and accommodations manual that PARCC has put out. It provides a lot of details that we cannot cover in any one presentation, not only about considerations for determining the appropriateness of accommodations, but also what does it look like and how to implement. So it's really important that you become well acquainted with that manual. So step 3. And this one I actually think is really important as you start to think about decision making for students. And before I go into these characteristics, I want to remind folks that accommodations and accessibility features are about access to the assessment. It does not change an accommodation or an accessibility feature will not and should not change the content of what we're measuring. And so as you think about making decisions, just always keep in your mind that this is about access and that we shouldn't be providing things that are an attempt to change what we're measuring. So if you think about an example of a student who is blind or newly blind, we might provide them the accommodation of a read aloud because they haven't learned Braille yet. However, if that student is several grade levels below, it is still not going to change that fact. So while they may be able to access the content, they are still going to struggle with that content because they are not performing at grade level. So first thing to think about as you're making decisions are the student characteristics. What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses, right? Are they blind? Do they have difficulty with executive functioning? Do they have a physical disability which prevents them from being able to manipulate a mouse or a pencil? Thinking about student characteristics. Test characteristics, this takes on a little bit more meaning when we both have online and paper assessments. So not only do we have to think about the content area when we're looking at accommodations, we also have to think about the format of the assessment. As you will see and probably already know, our accommodations are different by content area. And that goes to the validity piece, which I'll speak to next. But we also need to think about is what this assessment looks like and what students need to actively participate. As you know, this year is our first online assessment, and this assessment is different than just your traditional multiple choice assessment or just text entry. Right? We have items that require kids to build a graph by dragging and dropping things, or sorting different text into different pieces into a graphic organizer, which is very different than just clicking A, B, C, or D. And I think that's important to consider as we're talking about test characteristics and what a student will need to be able to do to respond. Finally, validity requirements, which I started to speak to in terms of maintaining the validity of the assessment. So we need to maintain what we are measuring. So when we talk about, I'm going to give an easy example which is not directly measured on the PARCC assessment, reading fluency. Reading fluency, right, if you think about it's the accuracy and ease of students reading. But if a student couldn't read the test themselves, could we do a read aloud and actually measure students' fluency? The answer is no, right? We would be measuring the person who is reading it to them, reading fluency. So we could not be measuring that, and we would not allow that as an accommodation. And I speak to that because one of the things we'll talk about at the end, toward the end of the webinar, is unique accommodations. And unique accommodation is an accommodation request that you would submit that is something that a student needs but is not on the list of accommodations and accessibility features we're going to talk about today. And one of the big considerations that the states will talk about as we determine whether it's an approvable accommodation is whether it maintains the validity of what we are measuring on the assessment. So that is a really critical piece. So, step 4, administering the accommodations, right? Sounds pretty straightforward, but as many of you know who have administered accommodations, there are a lot of details. So we really need to make sure that folks are appropriately trained to administer these accommodations. Some of them are quite easy. And like extra time, it's just maintaining the time, right, and maintaining a record of how long a student takes. Pretty easy. Might need a separate location. But others are quite complicated and have detailed directions, such as read aloud, scribing, signing, which actually require a good amount of preparation on the administrator's time. So if you are going to be administering a scribing for a student for the ELA assessment, you would need to go through and read the protocol, which is a detailed protocol for scribing. For those of you who did it for kneecap, you know it's not just writing down what the student says. It's quite complicated, and frankly, it's not natural. So that's something you not only want to practice yourself as an administrator, but practice with the students so they are comfortable with it as well. And which is important as we think about all of these accessibility features and accommodations that students, that it might look a little bit different from how they're getting it implemented in class, right? Scribing being a good example of that. If you were doing a read aloud for the math or ELA assessment, there are particular instructions related to those. So we have a standard administration. So for example, in the math, it's much more complicated. It will talk about how do you read when it says 2.5 and the cent sign, how do you read that, right? Do you say quarter? Do you say 25 cents? For example, it talks about those things in detail. How do you read decimal points? Those are the things that are in there. So there's that prep time. There's making sure that there's a process in place in the larger sense within your school system. How are teachers making decisions? How are they getting uploaded into the registration file, which is where some of them are, or the PNP file? We'll talk about these things later. Getting from the teacher who has this information into the file is going to be, that process is going to be different in every district, so districts really need to think about how that's going to happen, as well as monitoring accommodations and technology on the days of the assessment to make sure everything's going smoothly. And every year with NECAP, we had at least one incident where an accommodation was given inappropriately or not administered appropriately, so we want to prevent those things from happening. That's why it's really important to have a lot of preparation and communication. Finally, step 5, evaluation at the school and district levels, as well as we're going to get to the student level. So evaluating the effectiveness of the accommodations and accessibility features. And as we mentioned, it's not just at the student level. That is the one we tend to go to, which is important. But I also want to push us to think about the school and district level. One, about how was the process of determining accommodations and making sure that information gets into the data system. What was the communication and organization around students who needed extra time? Were they put in a separate room from the beginning, or were students being shuffled around at the end? What was that organization like? How could you improve upon that the next time? And finally, looking at the data around participation on accommodations and accessibility features. And although there's not one right or wrong answer around how many kids should have a certain accommodation, it would be, I would think that in a normal-sized district, if you didn't have any kids who had extended time, I would be surprised. That said, I also shouldn't see 80% of your kids with disabilities having extended time. So there's no one number, but looking at that data might signal for you where you might want to look deeper. And that's something that I know we do at the state level as well, is to look at the accommodations to see, is it looking higher than we would expect? And if so, what do we need to start doing to help folks understand how do you determine who this is appropriate for? And how do we follow up with districts where maybe we're not seeing any use of accommodations in particular areas? And is that accurate, or are folks not understanding what that accommodation is? So we follow up on that information. We hope at the school and district level you're also doing that. And at the student level, the way I think about this, is, and I like it, it's the third bullet down. I'm not going to redo the whole slide, but I think that one's the important one. If a student is not meeting expected levels of performance, is it because he or she is not receiving the necessary instruction, did not receive an accommodation, or is not using an accommodation effectively? So if you, based on your instruction, know, hey, this student gets this content, I know they should be doing well on this. And this is even talking classroom assessments. If they didn't perform well on an assessment that you gave in class, it's then thinking about, is it because they didn't have an accommodation that might have helped them access that test better? Or is it that they not really understand the content deeply enough to be able to demonstrate it? But looking at that and helping to understand the effectiveness of accommodations. Okay, so now we're going to take the next step from decision making into what are the accessibility features and accommodations that are available through PARCC. So I'm going to turn it over to Heather.
Okay. Hi, everybody. This is Heather Heineke. Can I use this? Okay, so like Phyllis said before, we have a couple of groups of support that students can receive. We have those things that all students can receive, like administrative considerations, which is a very fancy PARCC word for just the settings that students can be configured in order to take the test. And then the assessment features. Those all students can have access to. Some need to be identified ahead of time, which we'll get to, but no, students do not need to have an IEP, a 504 plan, nor do they need to be an English language learner in order to receive those supports. Those supports for students specifically with IEPs, 504 plans, or who are English language learners are those same as administrative considerations, the assessment features, and then the accommodations specifically are restricted to those students with IEPs, 504s, or who are EL students. How do you get this to advance? Sorry, hang on, having a little. Oh, okay. So these are the accessibility features. Now, one of the lovely things about PARCC is that we have lots and lots of opportunity. We have lots and lots of different ways that we can now offer supports because of the technology. So a lot of these may be very new. Some of these are very similar to things that we've seen on the NECAP assessment. So what you'll see here is you'll see paper-based testing on the left-hand side and computer-based testing on the right-hand side. You'll also notice that each accessibility feature has an equivalent. So if you have a paper-based test and you have one student who's taking or you have a computer-based testing environment and you have one student who's taking paper-based, you have comparable accessibility features for these students. So auditory aids, blank paper, highlighters, those things are fairly standard that we've seen before. General administration directions, read aloud, clarified, repeated. We've all done that before. There's glossaries in both the paper-based testing and a pop-up glossary in the computer-based testing. Magnification or enlargement devices, redirecting students, writing tools, spell checkers, visual aids and organizers, and line readers and a straight edge. Now you'll see a couple of asterisk ones, the highlighter and the flag items for review. You really need to be careful when especially, and this is especially for the paper-based testing, be very careful when you're implementing these. Highlighters cannot be so dark that they bleed through to the other side of the page. So if it bleeds through to the other side of the page, you'll all remember the NECAP conundrum that we had with highlighters, that you couldn't use them because they would bleed through and it would throw off the scanning machine in the test booklets for younger grades. The same thing with flagging items. There's several different ways that you can flag items, but you don't want them to bleed through to the other side. You want to think of using sticky notes or something like that so that you can actually see.
If they're using a pen or a pencil to actually, or the pencil they're using to flag items, they really need to stay away from the answer box, right? Because what you don't want is stray lines to go over an answer that they actually didn't intend. And that's the same thing with highlighters, staying away from the response area.
It's the same thing with NECAP. You know, when you had the box that was for the constructed response options. You didn't want kids to go outside of the box. You wanted them to contain inside the box, so it's kind of opposite. But
so I would suggest that you know your kids, so think about them. Some kids, you tell them that, and they will be fine. Other kids, you tell them that, and you really have to worry because they are marking things all over the place, and you know they will have a difficult time with that. So you might want to think about how else you could implement like that, like Heather said, is it using a Post-it or little flags and things like that to help them keep track of items? Or for a highlighter, are they using, like, I don't know, a transparency over it, and somehow you're clipping it, like they're clipping it on there in the highlighting? I think you can think about that in different ways. But again, just being thoughtful about how you implement that with your kiddos whom you know how they would be able to address those issues.
Okay, so here's the writing tools. Here's what a screenshot looks like of the writing tools online. You have here, you see the bold, the italic, the underline. You have bullets and numbers. You can copy and paste. It's the same sort of thing that you would see in any software. This is the highlighting for online. So this is a click and drag. So you would click and drag it, and then the minute you do, you see your options here at the top. You have yellow, pink, and blue, and then the students can select which color that they want. One of the suggestions that I heard is that depending on what the test question is, they can use different colors to mean different things in terms of highlighting the evidence. This is the Eliminate Answer feature for PARCC for the computer-based testing. You'll see these big red X's. This is a student-directed X out. This isn't an automatic, game show kind of thing where you just want one of the answers eliminated. The student can read through them, decide that that's not the right answer, and then exit out so they can kind of keep track of their thinking.
So just as an example, do you see how this X online is touching the bubble? Now, that's not going to impact it, obviously, because that's the way the X works. But if a kid were to X out an answer and it touched over the bubble on a paper test, that would be problematic. It's really thinking about maybe on a paper test how they might do a little X on the opposite side, right, of the far corner of the paper. So just thinking about that.
This is the text enlarger. We haven't had a chance to get a new screenshot for this. It's no longer a circle. I think everybody knows that it's hard to read in a circle. Nobody really reads like that. It has been changed to a rectangle. So that rectangle, this is now a rectangle.
And just to remind folks, this isn't actually the only way to enlarge the text online. So this is how you would just look at a focused area, but you can actually enlarge the whole screen, and it's different on different browsers. Sometimes it's the Control and the plus key, right? And so depending on the browser functionalities, it can go from like 400 to 1,000%. Now what that does, though, obviously, is sometimes it distorts what you can see. But I think that's why for a kid who does have a visual impairment, you need to have them go on the practice tests and things like that and try these things out to make sure it's going to work for them.
So let's talk earlier about the tasks that are required for students to know in order to interact with the test. Clicking and dragging, enlarging, working all of these tools. I can't tell you how important it is to have kids practice this stuff. And if you have something like text enlarger, or that your students needs, or a student you have needs the text to be bigger, practice with several different options. Practice with what's online, practice however it is that you normally however it is that you normally enlarge text for a student, practice with a smartboard. I mean, there's lots of different ways that you can do this, but practice so that you make sure that it doesn't become an unnecessary barrier for your students. This is the line reader. This line reader, the green box that you see, can be manipulated. So it can be smaller, it can be bigger, it can cover most of the page, it can cover more than one line if you wanted it to. It's very mutable in terms of what students need to be able to do. These are the accessibility features that need to be identified in advance. There are 3 of them. and answer masking, color contrast, and read aloud for mathematics assessments. So the answer masking, so for the paper-based tests, you see PBTs for paper-based and CBTs for computer-based. Again, they're equivalent. You could use the masking cards, you could use blank paper to temporarily cover answers. For the electronic online version, there's actually a student-directed feature where they can cover those answers as they need to. The color contrast, for of course a paper-based test, you would use a color overlay of the student's choice, and then online you can actually change the background color to several different colors for students. The read aloud for mathematics is an assessment feature identified. Any student can use it. This is for the English version of the online test. This is not what your Spanish students who would do better taking the test in Spanish. This is not that version. This is only for English. This accessibility feature requires a special test form. So it comes in a packet. So if you have a human reader, you'll have the paper version, and the student would have their own booklet.
So just a note on this. So it is identified in advance because all of these require a special form. PARCC state folks and experts that we work with work really hard to ensure that these forms work for kids. So for the color contrast, the forms that we have identified for color contrast, they go through all of the, if you think about all of the graphics and tables and all of that, to make sure that with all the different color contrast options, there aren't issues that provide a barrier for kids in accessing the test. For the read aloud, those of you who've ever used a screen reader know that it says words funny. The read aloud text-to-speech for math is not read like a screen reader. It's actually recorded, so we actually go back and fix those things. It's why there are minimal forms for this. And I also want to say, although this is open to all kids, that doesn't mean, hey, well, it won't hurt, let's just assign it to everyone. We should only be identifying these accessibility features for kids who use it in regular instruction. If you are not reading them their math test as part of classroom instruction, and that's what you do, then you should not be identifying it as an accessibility feature for kids. Now you may go, well, I don't normally. Sometimes on our big unit tests I do because it's a heavy load. Those are things you need to consider. But this isn't just, it isn't meant to, let me just assign it for all because it couldn't hurt. Because that's not its purpose.
Having too many supports, students having too many supports or supports that they're not used to having can actually work to a student's detriment in a testing environment. So here's an example. This is a screenshot of the answer masking. So you see the little I next to understand, and then when the I is crossed out, those are the ones that are masked. And the student can cover or not cover them if they need to. These are the options for the color contrast. You can see that there are 5 different options, well actually 6 if you count no adjustment, 6 different options for students. So it's worth it to try to practice with these to make sure that students are comfortable with them. So here's a summary of the accessibility features. So the one column has on demand or as needed. If a student is using these, they're student directed, they can turn them off, they can turn them on, they're always going to be there, kind of no big deal in a way in terms of administering and the test. Those in advance, those 3 in advance, those need to be in the PNP, the personal needs profile, which we'll talk about in a minute, because they do require some advanced planning.
So now we're going to move to accommodations. Now remember, from this piece forward, in particular this area, this is just for kids with disabilities. So for a student who has an IEP and it's written into their IEP, or a 504 and it's written into the 504 plan. This does not include kids who have a plan for RTI or just because they have a PLP. I want to make sure that is clear. IEP or 504 only. Okay? And if you'll notice, most of these revolve around students who are deaf and students who are blind. Because we are trying to capture so many of the other supports for kids through the accessibility features. So this is an overview of what is available in terms of presentation accommodations. We're going to step into some a little bit deeper. But remember, even for NECAP, we had presentation accommodations, response accommodations, timing accommodations, and setting accommodations. Setting actually was already taken care of. If you remember, they're now administrative features, so they're not even included here. We have some presentation accommodations, some response accommodations, and one timing accommodation that we'll get to. So, human read aloud, text-to-speech. For mathematics, we talked about that as an assessment feature that needs to be identified in advance because we're not measuring students' reading ability on the mathematics assessment. However, for the English Language Arts assessment, we are measuring students' reading. However, for a very small population of kids for whom they would not be able to access the assessment otherwise, a human read aloud or text-to-speech accommodation is available. So we'll talk about those criteria in a little bit more detail, but just to be clear, this is about access. This accommodation is for students who are at the beginning stages of learning to decode text. Okay. Screen reader. Screen reader generally, because we have the text-to-speach, screen reader is generally for kids used for kids who have visual impairments in this case, because it reads all of the text for them. But that is available both in ELA and mathematics. If you notice, if you need to use a screen reader for mathematics, that is an accommodation. So needing to determine if a student is using a screen reader for mathematics assessment, but maybe a text-to-speech would work, I think it's playing those pieces out. Screen reader also, if you were using a screen reader for a student who is blind, you will likely also want to order tactile graphics for that student for the mathematics piece as well. That's the bottom of the list, but I wanted to make sure I flagged those things. You'd have to order them separately. Hard copy of Braille for students who need it. Refreshable Braille. Refreshable Braille is, and we need a clarification, is only for ELA. Yeah. It is not for mathematics. We will update that slide for you when we send it out. But it is only for mathematics because of the graphics piece. And most folks who use Refreshable Braille know that, so shouldn't create too many issues. Closed captioning for the hearing impaired, that is for the videos we have for the ELA portion for students who are deaf or hard of hearing. A student reads aloud to themselves. Some students need to do that in order for them to comprehend and understand with their text better, which is fine.
This would be for students who use a whisper phone. Most often they'll use whisper phones.
Yeah. And would likely also need to be in a separate setting, right, so they're not disturbing other students. Assistive technology, and there's a variety of assistive technology that students may use. ASL video human signer for test directions. Again, so we have ASL video, but you can also have a human signer for the test directions, as well as the ASL video of tests and the human signer for the assessments. So this would equate to the read aloud for the ELA and mathematics assessments as well. And again, for a student who is deaf and hard of hearing, we'll talk about that in relation to the ELA piece and that read aloud. But it's not just because you have a student who is deaf, they can automatically get that signed ELA test. There are additional criteria, and we'll speak to that in a minute. Paper and pencil version of a test. So for a district who is moving to online assessments, and much of our state is, if an individual student needs a paper and pencil assessment for whatever reason, as an accommodation, they can order that one, and it would be an accommodation. Large print, Large print is 18 size font. So for a student who is blind, while this may meet some needs, it is really thinking about online, paper, pencil, what support is going to work best for kids. It may be that a large print with a CCTV might be the best option for a student. It also may be that the online assessment using a smart board makes the text large enough for the student, and that is the best way for the students to take the assessment. I think using the practice test materials and trying a variety of options is important, especially if you haven't done online testing with this student, to see what maybe individual support or combination of supports is going to best meet the student's needs and help them access the assessment. And I spoke to tactile graphics. So, read aloud options for ELA literacy assessment. We mentioned human reader and text-to-speech. And again, remember, if you're a human reader or ASL or human signer, there are specific criteria in thinking about how you translate or read that to make sure that, one, you don't give them information they shouldn't have, but that you make sure that you're reading it in also a reliable manner to ensure that students have equal access to the assessment. Now, getting to eligibility for this accommodation. And I want to be clear that if a student is identified for this accommodation and is determined that it is not in their IEP and they're not eligible for it, it could result in invalidating a student's assessment. So we really want to make sure that we understand the criteria and determine eligibility appropriately. Now, blindness or visual impairment. This is an easy one. This is a student who is likely newly blind or in the earlier years and hasn't fully learned Braille, so they couldn't access the assessment to Braille, or is unable to use Braille, could have a read aloud or text-to-speech for the ELA assessment. Because remember, we are measuring students' reading comprehension and decoding through this assessment if you look at our standards in a general way. What we have said and why we chose to implement this, and we hadn't in the past with NECAP, is for those kids for whom we can't separate out reading comprehension and decoding. For if we did not allow the read aloud, we would not be able to measure reading comprehension. That's who it's for. So think about that. As you're thinking about eligibility, this is about kids whom we wouldn't be able to measure their reading comprehension unless someone read it to them. That's a really small population of kids. Well, we may have many kids who struggle. I get that, and it is hard for them. They can access it. May be difficult for them and challenging, but they would be accessing the text. I'm going to skip to the bottom one and come back to the middle one. Deafness or hearing impairment that severely limits or prevents him or her from decoding text due to a documented history of early and prolonged language deprivation. So for many students who are deaf or have a significant hearing impairment, oftentimes their first language is not English. It is American Sign Language. So they are really learning a new language as they go to taking this assessment. So sometimes their reading ability is delayed. So it is not all kids who are deaf or have a hearing impairment, but it is for some kids for whom they could not access the assessment without having it signed for them. And finally, a disability that severely limits or prevents him or her from accessing printed text, even after varied and repeated attempts to teach the student to do so. Example, the student is unable to decode printed text or read fluently. Now I've had lots of questions. What does it mean, severely limits? And so some of the examples I gave back, again, is reminding people that it's about access, but saying this is the early stages of decoding. This isn't a kid who is reading at the 3rd grade level or the 2nd grade level. Those kids are generally decoding. Generally, not all of them. If they're reading on grade level, they were generally. This is kids at the early stages of decoding. So think about that as you're making your decisions and as your teams are talking. So one of those three had to be evident. And then these are some other considerations that schools need to be thinking about. We want to make sure that the student has access to printed text during routine instruction through reader or other spoken text or audio format or interpreter. In other words, if you are not providing this accommodation in everyday classroom instruction, this certainly shouldn't be the first time that you are presenting to them on the test, right? This is something they're already doing in instruction. Now, you may be providing a read aloud to kids above and beyond the population we've identified on a regular basis or on assessments. However, we still have, that does not mean that it is appropriate for them for the state assessment because of what the PARCC assessment is measuring. We have heard that kids who don't have significant needs, that perhaps this is happening in some of the regular classroom instruction. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're eligible. The other part, remember one of those first three still needs to be true. Students' inability to code, printed text or read Braille is documented in evaluation summaries. In all likelihood, you have assessments and should, if a student is using this and has it documented in their IEP, have assessments already that document the need for this accommodation. This doesn't necessarily mean you need to go out and conduct new evaluations. And finally, we want to make sure that the students continue to receive intensive instruction and ongoing interventions on the foundational reading skills. So in addition to one of the three on the previous slide, these things would be in place. These three things on this slide are in and of themselves do not meet the requirements to be eligible for this accommodation. Okay. Response accommodations, and we actually added the extended time one onto this slide. So response accommodations, speech to text. So here's where it gets a little more complicated. There's a speech to text accommodation for the constructive response items. And right, but it's a little bit different for constructive response and selected response. A scribe or human signer, well, we're going to get to them. So there's a couple of things. There are specific criteria if you were going to scribe for the ELA portion of the, for the writing portion of the ELA assessment. So the ELA assessment includes, in the performance-based assessment, part of the assessment includes 3 tasks. A literary analysis task, a narrative task, and a research task. Each of those 3 tasks have one, what we're calling a prose constructed response, in which it requires a student to type or write a response. This is similar to the extended response items on our kneecap, where a student would have to respond. For those items, there are special criteria for speech to text that we'll talk about. Scribing for, just like when we scribed for math assessment, there weren't specific criteria and directions to follow, but you had to write what the student said. Now, I would encourage you, if you are scribing, even if you are only scribing for the selected response for mathematics and ELA, and you're actually not scribing for the writing portion, it would still be important to practice and work with the student on that. Because if you think about it, it's not just as simple as a student saying A, B, D, right? It's actually sometimes having them explain to you where they want you to drag and drop stuff, or having them explain to you how they want you to draw a graph on the math piece. So it is a little bit more complicated than just responding to traditional selected response items. So it would be important to think about that as you're preparing students for the assessment and yourself to administer, to be the test administrator. Word prediction is an external device that can be used on the English Language Arts assessment, and we'll go into some specific criteria around that. Calculation device and mathematics tools on non-calculator section of the assessment, which is only a small piece of the math assessment, and we'll talk a little bit more about those criteria. This was not available on the kneecap assessment, so this is new. A Braille note taker or a Braille writer for a student who is blind. If they were to write their responses using a type, their responses using a Braille note taker or a Braille writer, they can do that, but those responses would have to be transcribed back into the paper or computer-based assessment. So they couldn't submit what they typed with the Braille writer or note taker. It would have to be transcribed back into the student's assessment, whether they're taking online or paper. Okay? Scribe or human signer. So again, for a student who you are a scribe for, so hand scribing for a student, again, if the student is taking an online assessment and you are doing a hand scribe, it will have to be entered back into the computer-based assessment. If you're using assistive technology, so a separate device for speech-to-text, which it is a separate device, it's an external device, the student may be using it, if they're using a separate software, they are speaking their text, right, what their response is. Someone would then have to either handwrite that in the student's response booklet or type that into the student's computer-based assessment. Because the computer-based assessment will not allow you to just close it and open another window and copy and paste, you can't do that. The student would be using a separate computer, and then someone would be physically retyping it into their computer-based assessment. Okay. And extended time, and then we'll go back to these other three I mentioned. Extended time. So for a student with a disability, they may have up to 1 school day to complete a unit of testing. So for mathematics, there are 2 performance-based assessment units and 2 end-of-year units. They could have up to 1 school day to complete each of those. Now, what I don't recommend is that you put a student in front of a computer or in front of a test at 8:30 in the morning and say, go, and you can stop at 3 o'clock. That is not helpful to the student or anyone else. If a student does need, most students they need an extra 15 minutes or an extra hour. But for those students who need significantly long time and will need that full school day, it's thinking about scheduling appropriate breaks for that student, making sure they eat lunch, and all of those things. But knowing that this can't be take a break, go have lunch with your friends, go talk out on the playground, talk about the test, do what you want, and come back. You would need to be then having a separate location for the student to eat lunch or making some arrangements. Just like many of you did with NECAP when a student went a little longer. You brought lunch to them, or they had a small group where they had lunch together and it was supervised by a teacher. Those are the things that you would need to consider as you think about extended time. We do know that this is a shift for Rhode Island because in the past all students had access to extended time, but PARCC has looked at the data both on what we know historically for how long it takes students to complete specific item types and read passages, but also based on the field test results that we had and how long it took students to complete those. And what we have done is looked at that average time that students took and then included an overage to make sure that most kids will complete it, again, other than those who need an accommodation, during that allotted window. Okay. So the 3 that are actually highlighted and the read aloud for the English language arts assessments, those 3 accommodations actually have, will have on the student report a note that references that they had an accommodation, and it's specific to the accommodation. So for example, for the read aloud, the accommodation would read something like, these results do not demonstrate or measure a student's ability to decode printed text, right? Because they had the read aloud assessment, we don't know if they can decode. So it's more measuring comprehension. So there would be text like that specific to these accommodations on the student report. This is the student report that goes home to the family. Okay?
Go into the,
You want it? Okay.
Oh, the one note about this is that especially for that speech to text, you'll see it says next to the yes for ELA, it'll say CR and SR. That's constructed response and selected response or multiple choice. So if you have a student who needs this, they may need it for both item types. That's all that is.
So you would have to do it. So one thing I heard from folks is on most of the assessments, actually my student is fine. They can write short responses. They can do the multiple choice and all of those drag and drops. But where they have a really hard time is with extended responses. So they only need the accommodation for the speech to text for the constructed response item. So there may be instances where for just extended responses kids need it, or they may need it for both because they have a physical disability which impacts their ability to use a mouse and things like that, or to write. So it may be one or it may be both, but they are listed separately. Okay. So speech to text. So IEP and 504 teams, this is for speech to text for the constructive response on ELA. So this is the piece that's measuring students' writing, if you think about it that way. Whether a student meets one of the following conditions: a physical disability that severely limits or prevents the student's motor process of writing through keyboarding. Likely students who are going to be using this have already been identified and probably have some occupational therapy written into their IEP. So these are kids who probably are already using text-to-speech software in instruction or for extended responses to their writing. Or a severe disability that severely limits the student from expressing written language even after repeated attempts to do so. The last two are similar to the other accommodation, the ELA accommodation for Read Aloud, that this needs to be documented in evaluation summaries. Again, and if this is being used in classroom instruction, which it should be if it's going to be identified for the PARCC assessment, you should already have the documentation for it. And we want to make sure that the student continues to receive ongoing intensive instruction to learn written expression. Word prediction, external device. Again, this is an external device, whether it's paper or pencil or online. And again, you should know who these kids are. They're already using things like Write Out Loud and those types of software during classroom instruction for their writing assignments. These are for students for whom, again, similar to the other one, severely limits or prevents a student from writing or keyboarding responses. So generally a physical disability there. Or a disability that severely limits or prevents students from recalling, processing, or expressing written language, even after varied and repeated attempts to do so. The last two are similar to what we've been talking about in terms of documenting it in evaluation summaries and receiving ongoing instruction. Finally, mathematics tools or a calculator on non-calculator sessions. Again, this is for a small population of kids for whom the student has a disability that severely limits or prevents the student's ability to perform basic calculations, i.e. addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, even after varied attempts to do so. Now, this will look a little bit different at the different grade levels. So I would expect as you're looking at your younger kids, they're 3rd and 4th graders, for whom in 3rd grade, they're actually really just getting into multiplication and division. They likely haven't mastered that anyway, or it will be at the end of that year, right, is where we want them to start getting fluent with that. So we would expect them to not be as fluent there. But addition and subtraction with basic numerals, they should be fine in. So thinking about that versus a high school student who can't perform these basic calculations. Again, this is about access. It's not about it's difficult for them, they make a lot of mistakes. This is about access, for whom they have a disability that severely limits or prevents them from doing so. And I would also just remind folks that even with the calculator, if they don't understand how to identify although there are some items that measure basic algorithms, there are many items, as you know, just like the kneecap assessment, that are word problems that are much more complicated, and students need to identify what is the operation they need to actually do. So that's still a very important part of instruction for kids, even if they are eligible for using a calculator on the non-calculator portions. I would add that when we're talking about the non-calculator portions, a calculator, but it also could be a multiplication table or a hundreds chart or things like that that would aid students in completing these. Number line. Any of those fall under a mathematics tool or a calculator when we're talking about the non-calculator sessions. As criteria, again, it's reminding us that the student is unable to perform calculations without the use of this calculation device, arithmetic table, or manipulative during routine instruction. So as part of math instruction, they are using these tools. The student's inability to perform calculations is documented in evaluation summaries and receives ongoing instruction and interventions to support calculations without a calculation device. Again, just like the scribe, the read aloud for ELA, and the word prediction, these are for very small populations of kids. I want to reiterate, I know I've said it a lot, the accommodations are about access. It is not about modifying the content. It is about allowing them access to the content. So, going to move over to accommodations for English language learners. So I just want to remind folks as we move away from students with disabilities, those are for kids who have an IEP and an accommodation is documented in their IEP, or a 504 plan and it's documented there.
Okay, so accommodations for English language learners. There's a couple of different things that you want to, 3 different things that you want to consider when you're thinking about supports for English language learners. You definitely want to consider whether or not they're beginning, intermediate, and advanced in terms of learning English. You also really want to consider, especially for Spanish translations of the math assessment, what their literacy level is in Spanish, what their schooling was in Spanish. We all know that content is tied to language. And so if they've learned that math in Spanish, they may do better with a Spanish translation of the test. You also want to think about the background factors, their age, their level of anxiety with English, whether or not they are shy or not, and how long they've been in the United States as well. They also, when PARCC was deciding which accommodations worked better for kids learning English, they actually went through a lot of the accommodations and did some studies and did some research to figure out which ones would match better and really would support them, rather than trying to figure out, you know, well, we'll just give you the list of accommodations and see what works. So on this chart, and this chart is actually in the PARCC accommodations manual as well, so you can see the solid black dot are highly recommended. The black dot with the, or the open black dot with the little tiny black dot are recommended, and then the open black dot may not be appropriate for these different levels. So extended time, you can see, is highly recommended. Word-to-word translations may not be appropriate for beginning students, but they may be appropriate for intermediate and advanced students because they have more language proficiency. So these are all very, these would all be helpful in trying to figure out which accommodations you would need. So these are response accommodations for English language learners identified in advance. So you have extended time, which Phyllis went over. Responses dictated in English for mathematics and English, the speech-to-text or human scribe, the word-to-word dictionary, the Spanish translations. You have 2 options with the Spanish translations. The online version is stacked. So the English is on top, and then the Spanish is on top, and then Spanish is on the bottom. And then the paper, you have Spanish on the right and English on the left. Then you have verbal translations. You have an online text-to-speech translation in Spanish, or you can have somebody read it aloud in Spanish. We've also had requests for a human reader to sit next to the computer while the student takes it online. That is also a possibility as well. And then, of course, you can clarify the directions in your native language, in any student's native language. Spanish is the only set of, is the only translated test that we offer for PARCC in Rhode Island. But if you have a student who speaks Chinese, those directions actually, you can clarify them in Chinese, and I think that there is also a script in Mandarin as well.
So there's the top 10 languages, and I don't know them off the top of my head, but they are in the
they're in the manual.
The top 10 languages are translated, but you could certainly, for directions, you can translate them into other languages. You cannot translate the assessment itself into any other language. And if you are doing a human reader for the Spanish translation, it is reading the Spanish version of the assessment for mathematics only.
Okay. So these are, hang on, did I get all, whoops. Sorry, I think I got, I got a little bit too excited here. So here we have accommodations for special circumstances. So we have unique accommodations, emergency accommodations, and the student accommodation refusal form. So unique accommodations are anything in PARCC or any accommodation that you feel a student should receive, or that uses something in their instruction that they need that is not offered in PARCC. And you can't find anything that will help, that will support the student in this particular way. You have a unique accommodation form that you can fill out and send to us, send to Phyllis or to Kevin here at RIDE. And then the PARCC accommodations work group will go over that. And the accommodations work group are all the state representatives of all the states. So we talk about everybody's accommodations there. And then we decide whether or not it's allowable or not. There's also, do you want to say something?
Yeah, so two things. One, obviously we don't talk about names and any of that stuff.
Yes.
It's just about what the request is. And the other thing is, again, you can always give us a call first to say, hey, am I just way off on this? We'd be glad to answer that. But be thinking about two things. One is, will it impact our ability to measure what we're trying to measure? So in thinking about the content, right, of what we're trying to measure, would it change that? So reading, remember I talked about like reading the reading fluency test, clearly wouldn't allow us to measure a student's reading fluency. Thinking about that piece. And the other is, which tends not to be as much of an issue, but would it impact test security in any way? That's usually less of an issue, but it's more about the validity, but thinking about those two pieces. So we want to still make sure we have a valid and reliable assessment.
So emergency accommodations, this follows very closely to what we had for kneecap. So you have a student who broke an arm or leg, not a leg, an arm or a wrist, broke their eyeglasses or equipment that they use, something returning from a prolonged injury or illness. That's what we would use the emergency accommodation for. You don't need to, there is a form you can download from PARCC for this. We don't need to see that form here at RIDE. That is for your own records. We do want to also mention, though, that these accommodations and supports, and I actually recommend that you put all of the supports a student would need, not just the accommodations. So even if they're assessment features, you include them in a student's IEP. It's not required, but I really suggest that you do it only because students move from one district or one school to the next, and it helps helps everybody keep track of what works for a student. If you don't get that done, emergency accommodation forms are not the way to go. That's not the purpose of this. Did you want to add more about that?
No, just because we've had the question, which is why we put it in there, that this isn't because I didn't have time to schedule a meeting. This is something happened with the student that would prevent them from accessing the assessment. So you need to reconvene your IEP team meetings if you need to, or 504 meetings, to make sure that you have time.
Mm-hmm. The student accommodation refusal form, everybody knows that kids they have accommodations in their IEP that they they're embarrassed about, or they don't want to have anymore, whatever the reason is. So there's two things you need to do. You continue to make that accommodation available to the student should they need it eventually, or would they want it. You also have to notify staff as necessary when they refuse it, and then you document it. There is also an accommodation refusal form from PARCC that you need to fill out. That, again, is not something that we need. It's just something for your records.
Right. And that is a local decision, whether you document it there or whether you choose to document another way, but it's a resource for you to be able to use.
So there are several appendices. There's actually way more than this that PARCC has for accommodations. So these are the three forms. You have accommodation requests, emergency, those sorts of things. There are appendices at PARCC Online for scribing, for read aloud, for those sorts of things that you really, really need to look at to make sure that you administer these accommodations correctly. It gives you all of that, all the information you can possibly want. We know that it's a lot of information, but if you have any questions as you read through all of those appendices, please let us know. So here we have the personal needs profile. This is that online Excel spreadsheet that everybody's been trying to fill out with the accommodations and those accessibility features that need to be turned on in advance. The purpose of this PMP is to gather all the information that's required and is necessary to make sure that the student has that access that Phyllis has been talking about. So I think you guys are probably all pretty clear about what is included in that PMP, so I won't spend too much time on it. There is a registration file also that is separate from the PMP. Do you want to talk about
that? So the registration file had to be in sooner, and that documents all the kids who need to take assessments. In order to allow a little bit more time for all the accommodations piece, it is in two separate files. So the registration piece has some of the accommodations, and those are primarily related to, as you can see on that third bullet, well, the third line bullet, hard copies of accommodated format that need to be shipped. Those ones, so like Braille forms, large print, those are in the registration file because we need those numbers and that information earlier in order to make sure we get them sent. For online accommodations, because it's automated, right, it can be a little bit later, so all the rest of them are in the PNP file. So that PNP information is actually found in two places. They don't overlap, but just in two different places based on the type that they have. Now, what that doesn't mean is that if you get a student who moves into your district the week before testing that needs a Braille assessment, that you can't get one. You can order one. But we certainly needed to know who the bulk of those kids are prior, because it is a long process to prepare Braille tests and to get them printed. And we certainly want to have a good number of, a good estimate of what number that is so we can have them printed, because we don't want to underprint or really overprint too many, because frankly it's time consuming and costly. So we asked that they got in, and that was January 7th. It was last week that those were due. Like I said, if you didn't get those in, you can still do that. For hard copies of those pieces that were in the registration file, the sooner the better, and you would have to go in and manually order those as well as put it in the registration file. But for the PNP, you do have a little bit more time to get those done. And you can update this as you move along.
So here are some more resources. Well, these are actually, they're more on at PARCC Online, and then of course there's the TestNav 8 tutorial as well. And you can access all of the accessibility features and the training modules. You can do all of that kind of work with your students on by accessing.
Yeah, and I can't emphasize enough how, well, first of all, I think an understanding of the accessibility features and accommodations is important for all educators. But if you are going to be at an IEP team making decisions around an accommodation, or if you are going to be administering an accommodation, it is very important that you be reading the manual as well as the appropriate appendices to those accommodations in which you are talking about. We really want to make sure folks have a good understanding so they can implement these accommodations with fidelity. So we do not have situations where we have to invalidate an assessment because accommodations weren't implemented appropriately.
Do we want to show them the What I'm going to do now, to help you kind of see, let me see if I can make this smaller. This is something that I created, and we are going to post this.
Along with the PowerPoint?
Yes. And I made 2 of these. These are actually, this one's for the math. This isn't actually not a cheat sheet, but more of a condensing of all of the information, accessibility features, accommodations, all of that. What is, not only that, but what is on the PNP layout, the file layout, and what is in the manual.
So it's really a good reference sheet to use in combination with the manual itself and the PNP file as you are determining accommodations and completing the PNP.
Right. So here we have, just to outline the key here, this little number, the number and the letter, that is where you can find information on eliminate answer choices in the manual. So all of these little numbers, that's what that means. Then here you have this capital AJ. That's the column of the PNP Excel file where you will find external AT device. If you go there, you put a little Y or an X, that's where you find that, that information. So I tried to do a crosswalk as best I could. You can see here just from basically from looking at it that not everything is included in the PNP. It's really important to look at that PNP because they have some more information in there about each of these accommodations in terms of how you fill that out. So we will make sure, this is math and I have ELA, and we will make sure that those are posted, and hopefully that's something that you'll find helpful. So with that, I think we are done. We have quite a few questions here.
So before we go to people who have their hands raised, we're going to respond to some of the questions that have been typed in. Once we finish those, we'll go to the folks who have their hands raised. So will this webinar be available after today online? Is it printable? We will post it on the RIDE website along with all of these resources. We'll post the PowerPoint as well as, hopefully if all goes well, the recorded webinar. Do scores count if students receive a human reader accommodation? Yes, they do. They will have that notation on their report as long as they are appropriately identified for it and it is implemented with fidelity. Yes, they will receive, their scores will count. Is students' score penalized for using speech to text? Same thing. No, as long as they are identified appropriately following that guidance and implemented appropriately,
it should be fine.
It should be, yeah, it will be fine. How do you assign one student the read aloud test form? Most students use the main form. How do you signify and make sure you have the correct form? So if you are doing paper-based testing, and you have to put it in, if you're doing paper-based testing, which I think this is referring to paper-based testing, you have to indicate that you are doing a read aloud in the registration file, and you actually get a specific kit that comes with 2 tests for that student. So you will know it's a read aloud kit.
It will be shrink wrapped together.
Yep. So it's a specific form for that student. Okay. Can a student have a human reader and a scribe if they are eligible for both?
Yeah.
Again, make sure you review those criteria. Did you say that? Yes, we'll post all of it on the RIDE website. Thank you. You're welcome. And can a non-certified staff member, a TA, be a human reader?
Depends on what's non-certified.
So they can only be a proctor. Non-certified staff can only be proctors and support administration. A test administrator would need to be a certified person, would need to be there as well. So to the extent that person would be in a room themselves implementing this, that would be a no. They need to be certified to administer the test and to be assigned as the test administrator. We already sent our roster uploads to the state. We need to modify some human readers. Can we still do this? Yes, you can. You need to update your file, and we know that will be continuing to happen. If you are doing, well, if you're doing paper-based tests, you will likely still get those, but just make sure if you get an extra packet, that you send those kits back if they were not used in the non-scorable materials. And Kevin will go over all of this in this next round of trainings that's coming up about sending materials back.
Are human readers assigned on a one-to-one basis? That depends on what your student needs. If your student needs a one-to-one, somebody all to themselves, then that's obviously something that you would do. Human readers for a read aloud on the math test, if you have 4 or 5 students who need that accommodation, you can put them in a small group, and you will get the same test form. So it depends on what the situation is. You can't have it on a one-to-one basis.
Okay. I am looking through for hands raised, and at one point there were hands raised, but it looks like they put them down because we answered their question. So if you have a question, please raise your hand so we can unmute you. If there are no questions in the next few minutes, we will end the webinar, but we will certainly post all of the materials. And as always, you can always submit questions to myself or Heather. We continue to get them. And sometimes, folks, I hope that you know, sometimes we don't answer you immediately. Sometimes that's because, frankly, I have a hard time getting through my email. But other times it's a new question, and I want to make sure that I check in with the other PARCC states so we have consistent responses. Because I wouldn't want to allow or disallow something that another state is allowing, right? So we want to have a consistent protocol.
To that end, just as by way of announcement, I've gotten some calls about the scribe protocol that was not posted on PARCC Online. It should be posted today. There were some tweaks that we had to go through and some conversations that we had to discuss. So please check again today. It should be there, the scribing protocol.
Valerie Enos, I see you have your hand raised. You actually, I didn't have the, you didn't put in the audio pin, so it won't allow me to unmute you. I guess you'll have to put that in, and then I can be unmute you. Or if that gets too complicated, you can type the question in, and I will respond.
Does it pop up if there's a question? We hope you found this helpful. Please let us know.
Okay. Oh, we got some more that popped in. Hold on. A bunch more questions. There's Valerie Enos. Can I certify teacher assistant? Well, teaching assistants aren't certified as teachers. Certified educators. A test in a one-on-one setting, no, it has to be a certified teacher. Again, they can be a proctor to support, but they cannot in a one-on-one setting unless they're being supervised, unless there's a teacher in the room supporting that. If your school is doing computer-based testing but would like to EL students to have paper-based tests, do we fill out a unique accommodations form?
No.
No, I mean, again, I would.
You order it like you would order it as an accommodation for them.
But I want to be clear that if they're doing paper-based because a computer-based test is not appropriate for them, they are doing it for both content areas in 3 through 8, and at high school it's by test. So they can't do ELA online and math paper or vice versa. It needs to be both portions. How do you suggest that a human reader decision is made? I guess I want to make sure I understand that question. I'm not sure. So if it's human reader versus text-to-speech, or just whether a student needs a read aloud.
I would try, you will always want to go back to what you're doing in the classroom as much as possible. You know, if a student receives a human reader for everything, that's one thing. You know, I mean, it's definitely I would suggest that you start there.
But the human reader versus the text-to-speech accommodation, so in the tutorial area, there is a place for a student to try out and listen to the text-to-speech, so they can make sure that, you know, it's not going too fast for them, or the tone is right, so they can hear it to make sure that it's okay for them. Again, if an adult is doing a human reader, that doesn't mean we get to emphasize words we'd like to. The directions are very clear on when we emphasize things, you know, when there's bold text and those kinds of things. So we need to be clear on those pieces. Can a teacher assistant serve as a proctor? Yes, they can serve as a proctor.
Are human reader kits available for multiple students to use? Yes. If you have students who are all taking the math test who need a read aloud, you can get, when you submit that in the registration file, if it's a paper-based test, they will send you the same test form for all 4 or 5 students, so you can do a small group read aloud.
On a computer-based test, if a student needs a read aloud for the math, you put that on the P&P, yes. But then how does the system know when to turn on the audio?
It's magic.
So that's what happens on the back end. That information in the PMP is then tied to the student's login information. So when that student logs in, they will have a student-specific code. And when they log in, it will know that that student gets that form of the test. That's why these need to be sent in ahead of time, because it will be tied to their login.
One thing I want to add to that, you aren't assigning them a test form. You're only selecting the assessment feature or the accommodation the student needs. You're not picking a test form for them. That is all done based on what you send them on the back end in the PARCC database. So if you say they need a human reader for math, and you put in a 5 or whatever the code is in that column for that, that 5 tells the system to assign a certain test form. You're not picking one.
Can you please clarify if a human reader and read aloud are the same terms? So we have used a lot of terms to mean the same thing. Originally, we talked about text-to-speech as a separate accommodation from read aloud and human reader. And what we've talked about is that a read aloud accommodation can be implemented in many ways. It can be implemented through text-to-speech, right? The computer does the reading, or a human reader. So they are the same thing, although know that the requirements around who it's appropriate for are different for math and ELA. But yes, it's just a matter of how it's being implemented. So you will see human reader is when a human is reading it, you'll get those 2 forms sent. You'll see text-to-speech if it's computer-based.
Read aloud has become sort of the catch-all phrase for verbally reading or speaking the test. I don't know what else to call it. It's become sort of a catch-all phrase for any of that.
Just sure. Kristen, I'm going to try. Kristen Moniz, I'm going to try and unmute you. Kristen, you should be unmuted if you still have a question. If you're talking, I can't hear you, so please check. Oh, Kristen is missing a mic. Okay. I did unmute you, but if you want to type it in, I'd be glad to answer it. But we have another one. Can you provide more detail about when we complete the PMP, who typically completes this, and what does this process look like? So PMP information is obviously collected at the local level, and that process may look different in every district. I know some districts are collecting all accommodation and accessibility features through one form that they're documenting it based on IEPs. And all of that is then being entered into an Excel file at the central office, and they are then uploading that information. In smaller districts, it may be that you only have small numbers of kids, so they may be handling it at the school level where that information is getting uploaded differently. It doesn't matter. So I think districts have options about how they collect that information from the teacher level to getting in the system, but it is a separate file that needs to be submitted. And I will make sure that we post that date off the top. I know it's in February at some point, but I can't recall the exact date.
I do suggest, just having tried to put these sheets that I showed you about math and ELA together, if you are the only person in your school who's been assigned to do this PMP for whatever reason, find somebody to work on this with. It is a very complicated process, not just deciding which accommodations and supports a student would need, but getting them correctly onto that PMP. You'll need some help with that. It'll be a student-by-student review of everything. So find a pal.
Yeah, there was another error. The spell check is not embedded now. It's still not available, so that is still to come. So it's always still an external device. That was the question. And it's our understanding that PMPs are completed for each student. That is correct.
Yes. So you'll have, it's a PMP, you'll have like a roster, and every student will have a row. And so the columns go all the way across.
So for those of you, and most of you who I see asking questions, do have an account with Pearson Access Next, which is the system where all of these files are uploaded, but is also where you can access the training materials and file layouts. So I would encourage you to look at the PNP training as well as the PNP file. And Mike Ferry's office, I'm sure many of your districts have been in touch with him around the registration file, are certainly available to support on the technical end of uploading that file. We are more the program questions. So if you, program-wise, in terms of eligibility and how to think about that, we can certainly support you there. In terms of, I got an error when the file was uploaded, that's a Office of Data Analysis and Research question. For students with IEPs, does the PNP form get completed during the IEP meeting? Same for 504 students. So I would, again, I think districts are doing this in different ways. So one district I know created like a Google Docs type of form in which they're collecting all of the information. So they may be sitting down at an IEP meeting and updating that. Some districts are going through IEPs, not necessarily at meetings, and discussing these things. But initially, these discussions, yes, are happening at an IEP meeting. The IEP likely documents everything a student, all of the PMP features, hopefully. We don't want to create a system where you have a PMP form and an IEP, because it's not necessary that there's a PMP form, but the information does need to get into that file layout and uploaded into the PARCC system. So how districts do that?
What I would suggest, just to make this a little bit easier, what I would suggest you all do as a place to start is read the documentation about the accessibility features and the accommodations in the manual and on the appendices and all of that. Make the decisions which accommodations each student needs first. Get that all done. Don't even worry about the PMP yet. Just get all of your decisions done. Worry about the documentation after that in terms of getting the IEP, the 504, that organized. Then discuss it with your district what that process is for uploading that information in the PMP. Make that part one of your last bits because you have to have all of your supports lined out first.
And yes, there is a sample file, Excel file, and it's uploaded in CSV, which is comma separated something. But it looks like an Excel file, but much more complicated. But yes, so there is a file layout. It is in Pearson Access Next. Can you please describe the difference between human reader and read aloud? Like we said, read aloud is more of a broad version. So read aloud could be implemented via text-to-speech. So the computer is reading it aloud, or it can be implemented via human reader. So your test administrator is reading it aloud.
You could also use technology. You know, if your student has a specific screen reader that they like to use. That's another version of a read aloud.
Leslie, you can call me if you still have questions.
You can call either of us if you have anybody. You all have our email addresses and our phone numbers.
I think.
So please call us.
Oh, one more. Does it mean that a non-certified TA can't do a small group? Yes. Non-certified can only proctor.
You'd have to have a certified test administrator in there with the TA, or with the TA.
Okay, Omar, is it expected that we have an IEP meeting for every student between now and the administration of the assessment? So, ideally, if you think that, so if in the student's IEP it is extended time, no, you probably don't need to reconstitute an IEP meeting unless you think that there are other accommodations that might be appropriate for the student. However, if there are changing or new accommodations, I would prioritize those IEP team or 504 meetings first. If you think that there's going to be changes based on online assessment or new assessments. But yes, an accommodation does need to be in a student's IEP or 504 plan if they are going to get it on the PARCC assessment. And yes, not all accommodations have previously been available. So I think there's two issues. There's one is having the physical meeting and having those discussions, and two is having them in what some districts have is the online system for developing IEPs. And I think that's a more technical problem that districts will have to address. If it's not in your drop-down menu, how do you get that information into the IEP? And that's something that I can't answer not knowing the system, but certainly would be happy to try and help someone troubleshoot on a more one-on-one basis to be able to talk that through. And yes, I realize that's a lot of IEP meetings, but again, like I said, if the accommodations are not changing, there is no need to have a new IEP meeting. If they are changing, so think about the couple, like if it's Braille, large print, that's not, you don't need to have a new meeting. If it's a new read aloud, yes. In fact, no student in Rhode Island, unless they reconvened an IEP meeting, probably will have a read aloud because it wasn't for ELA, because it was not allowed under NECAP. So you would have to convene one for that one, and in particular, Subscribe was in there, but word prediction and calculator on non-calculator sections, those are 3 new ones, as well as ASL video and human signer. Those are the 4 that I would certainly concentrate on. Yeah,
unless they have an IEP.
Those are the 4 that I would concentrate on. Those are new. So name those again. So the new ones are read aloud for ELA, whether that's text-to-speech or human reader, right? It's still a read aloud. And that is new. We did not have that under NECAP. It was considered a modification. The word prediction software, right, using word prediction for the ELA assessment, that is also new. Calculator or math tools on the non-calculator section of the assessment. And the last one was the ASL video or human signer. Those are the big ones that are new. Now, some of them look a little bit different in how we implement them, but I think the priority would be any of those 4 new ones. So for example, a student who had large print in their IEP and you are taking online assessments. If a student can access the assessment online and it's not necessarily large print paper, that would be less of a priority because you are getting them large print on the computer. Ideally, you would want to reconvene and make sure everyone's clear on how they're accessing the test, but they would still be able to access the test and get large print just in a different format. I would really concentrate on the new ones. Okay. So it looks like we've answered at least all the questions for now. I know as folks go back and start to dive deeper into this and start to read the manual again and start to make decisions and get everything up there, more questions are going to come up, and that's fine. Just reach out to us, and we will get back to you. Thank you, everyone, and have a good afternoon. Take care. Bye-bye.